fear spreads across Europe. The attack on Lindisfarne Monastery was not merely an isolated incident of violence. For the men who returned to Scandinavia bearing gold, silver, and precious objects, that expedition proved that lands existed far beyond the horizon where wealth could be quickly won. To the peoples of Christian Europe, however, it signified something entirely different: the onset of a threat no one yet understood. In the months following the raid, accounts of the mysterious northern warriors began to circulate among monasteries, villages, and royal courts. Monks copied letters describing tall men, clad in wool and leather, who emerged from the sea in swift vessels, struck without warning, and vanished before any army could react. Many believed these stories were exaggerated by fear. Others thought such an attack would never happen again. After all, crossing the North Sea was perilous. Storms, currents, and unpredictable winds made the voyage a formidable challenge. But the Vikings had learned a valuable lesson. The reward was worth the risk. While Anglo-Saxon kings debated how to protect their monasteries, Scandinavian craftsmen toiled ceaselessly in the shipyards. New longships were built, existing vessels were upgraded, and more young men pledged their services to local chieftains. Joining an expedition became an opportunity to gain wealth, prestige, and respect within the community. Before long, small fleets began leaving the fjords of Norway and the coasts of Denmark every summer. Some headed for England. Others sailed toward the islands of Scotland and the coasts of Ireland, or crossed the North Sea toward the European mainland. The raids ceased to be exceptions. They became a part of everyday life. Along the northeast coast of England, entire communities lived in a state of constant vigilance. Fishermen scanned the horizon before heading out to sea. Farmers stopped their work whenever they spotted unknown vessels approaching the shore. In many villages, the sound of a bell came to mean only one thing: the Vikings were coming. Monasteries remained the preferred targets, not because they were the most strategically important locations, but because they held everything the invaders sought. They were wealthy, poorly defended, and usually situated near the coast or along navigable rivers. Gold chalices, ornate crosses, silver coins, imported fabrics, and food stores represented a massive prize for groups that needed to transport everything quickly back to their ships. A few years after Lindisfarne, another major religious center became a target for the northern seafarers: the Monastery of Jarrow. Famous for housing one of England's largest libraries, Jarrow was a center of learning where monks copied manuscripts, preserved works from antiquity, and taught Latin, theology, and history. Among its religious community lived the Venerable Bede, one of the greatest chroniclers of the Middle Ages. When the Vikings arrived, they repeated the strategy that had already succeeded at Lindisfarne. They struck swiftly. They looted everything of value. They departed before any reinforcements could arrive. News of the attack spread with alarming speed. If even such revered places were not safe, where could anyone be secure? Meanwhile, on the other side of the Irish Sea, another target caught the attention of Scandinavian seafarers. On the small island of Iona, off the west coast of present-day Scotland, stood one of the Celtic world's most important religious centers. Founded by Saint Columba more than 2 centuries earlier, the monastery was renowned for its spiritual influence and for preserving manuscripts of immense value. Like Lindisfarne, Iona seemed like a perfect target. It was isolated, it had a few defenses, and it had amassed wealth over generations. Attacks on Iona were repeated several times in the decades that followed. Many monks abandoned the island for good, taking with them the relics they managed to save. Others remained, determined to rebuild what had been destroyed. As the monasteries suffered successive attacks, the Vikings also began to realize something important. Rivers were just as useful as the sea. Light vessels like longships could navigate shallow waters, allowing warriors to advance far beyond the coast. Cities, located dozens of kilometers inland, previously considered safe due to the distance, became accessible. This discovery vastly expanded the reach of their expeditions. Now, any community near a navigable river could be taken by surprise. In Ireland, various monastic towns began building makeshift walls. In England, some communities stationed permanent lookouts near the coast. In regions of present-day France, merchants avoided storing large amounts of wealth in coastal ports. Fear slowly transformed daily life. Even so, kings continued to struggle to organize an effective response. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms rarely cooperated with one another. Territorial disputes consumed resources and weakened alliances. While one kingdom faced a Viking attack, another might be busy fighting its own neighbor. The invaders quickly realized this division. They exploited local rivalries. They targeted less protected regions. They attacked where they encountered the least resistance. Across the English Channel, the powerful Carolingian Empire was also beginning to feel the initial impact of Scandinavian raids. During the reign of Charlemagne, the empire had achieved massive territorial expansion. However, after his death, succession disputes weakened central authority. The Vikings sensed this vulnerability and launched small-scale raids on the coasts of Francia, plundering villages and monasteries located along the major rivers. Each expedition served as a learning opportunity. Navigators refined their routes. They became familiar with new coastlines. They discovered which rivers allowed them to push inland. They learned which regions held the greatest wealth. The most experienced chieftains even began sketching mental maps of maritime routes, passing this knowledge on to future generations. With each passing summer, more ships crossed the North Sea. More young men dreamed of fame. More chieftains vied for command of expeditions. An activity that once seemed extraordinary was becoming part of the Scandinavian economy. Plunder funded new voyages. New voyages brought more wealth. That wealth strengthened local chieftains. And more powerful chieftains could build even larger fleets. Without realizing it, Europe was facing a historic shift. The raids were ceasing to be mere episodes of piracy. They were beginning to reveal a much broader strategy. The Vikings were not simply seizing opportunities. They were learning the inner workings of the kingdoms they intended to confront. Each landing provided information on geography, politics, trade, and defenses. Each return to Scandinavia deepened the experience of those extraordinary navigators. The Christian world still believed it was facing small bands of raiders, but in the icy fjords of the north, something far greater was beginning to take shape. Expeditions became more frequent. Crews grew in size. Chieftains amassed enough wealth to gather hundreds of warriors under a single command. The Viking Age was entering a new phase, and soon, those men would stop crossing the sea solely to plunder. They would begin to stay in foreign lands, and eventually, they would begin to conquer them. For decades, the Vikings had perfected the art of the lightning raid. They would emerge from the sea without warning, plunder their targets, and vanish before any army could react. This strategy had worked remarkably well during the early years of the Viking Age, bringing wealth, fame, and prestige to countless Scandinavian chieftains. But as expeditions became more frequent, a new idea began to take hold among the northern leaders. What if it were possible to stay longer in foreign lands? What if, instead of crossing the sea every year, warriors could establish permanent bases close to their targets? This shift in thinking would mark one of the most significant transformations in Viking history. In the early days of the raids, most ships returned to Scandinavia before the onset of winter. Storms made navigation extremely dangerous, and remaining in enemy territory seemed like an unnecessary risk. Over time, however, the Vikings began to gain a better understanding of the regions they raided. They learned where to find food. They discovered which rivers offered shelter. They identified strategic locations for setting up temporary camps. Armed with this knowledge, some expeditions began to stay beyond the summer months. For the first time, groups of warriors were spending the winter far from home. This decision completely changed the dynamics of the raids. It was no longer necessary to cross the North Sea for every new incursion. The Vikings could remain close to their targets and strike repeatedly throughout the year. The initial encampments were relatively simple. They consisted of areas enclosed by wooden palisades, built in easily defensible locations. Situated near rivers or sheltered inlets, they allowed ships to remain safe while warriors rested, stockpiled supplies, and planned new operations. Over time, these bases became increasingly sophisticated. Tents gave way to permanent structures. Storehouses were built to hold food and equipment. Blacksmiths accompanied the expeditions to repair weapons and forge tools. Some bases even evolved into small settlements. Meanwhile, European kingdoms faced a growing problem. Traditional defense strategies simply did not work against this new type of threat. Mobilizing a medieval army could take days or weeks to gather enough men. Often, by the time soldiers finally arrived at the scene of an attack, the Vikings had already departed. Now, with permanent bases scattered across various regions, the invaders became even harder to combat. Instead of appearing for only a few days in the summer, they could remain active for months. In Ireland, coastal towns were the first to feel this shift. The Vikings were no longer limited to raiding isolated monasteries. They began attacking trading hubs, seizing goods, and controlling vital maritime routes. Some regions became so vulnerable that entire communities chose to abandon certain settlements and seek refuge further inland. At the same time, Scandinavian seafarers were discovering new opportunities. Trade. For a long time, Vikings were portrayed solely as warriors and raiders, but the reality was far more complex. Many chieftains realized that trading could be just as profitable as raiding. Arab silver, Eastern textiles, European wine, weapons, amber, furs, and slaves circulated through a trade network connecting Scandinavia to extremely distant regions. Some Viking outposts became important trade centers. Merchants from diverse backgrounds met to exchange goods, information, and wealth. This further expanded the Scandinavians' knowledge of the world around them. With each passing year, their expeditions became more organized. Their vessels evolved as well. Shipbuilders constantly refined the longships. The ships became sturdier, faster, and capable of carrying ever larger numbers of warriors. Large fleets began to emerge. Where once only a few ships sailed, entire groups could now be seen crossing the sea together. This shift vastly increased the Vikings' military power. A small monastery was no longer the only possible target. Entire cities were now at risk. In Francia, territory that had once belonged to the vast Carolingian Empire, attacks became increasingly frequent. The great French rivers offered perfect routes for the Scandinavian navigators. The Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, all of them allowed for deep penetration into the interior. The Vikings could appear in places where no one expected to find them. Villages were looted. Markets were destroyed. Monasteries lost treasures accumulated over centuries. Local rulers were often forced to negotiate directly with the invaders. Some preferred to pay large amounts of silver to spare their cities from destruction. This practice would later become known across various regions of Europe. It was a costly solution, Yet it often seemed less dangerous than facing the warriors from the north in open combat. Each successful payment sent a powerful message. Raiding worked. The Vikings returned home bearing not only wealth, but also the certainty that Christian kingdoms could be pressured and exploited. Meanwhile, a new generation was growing up in Scandinavia. Young men who had heard stories about Lindisfarne, Jarrow, Iona, and dozens of other successful raids. For them, sailing west was no longer an extraordinary adventure. It was almost a tradition. The children of those early invaders dreamed of surpassing their parents' achievements. They wanted to command larger ships, amass greater wealth, explore unknown territories, and above all, win enough fame to be remembered for generations. Over the years, the distinctions between raiders, traders, and settlers began to blur. Many groups performed all these roles simultaneously. They traded when it was advantageous. They fought when necessary. They established settlements whenever opportunities arose. Viking expansion was evolving beyond a mere series of sporadic raids. It was transforming into a far broader phenomenon, a force capable of influencing economies, redrawing borders, and challenging entire kingdoms. European rulers were slowly beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. Yet they did not fully comprehend what was to come. For in the fjords of Norway, the islands of Denmark, and along the coasts of Sweden, some of the most ambitious Viking leaders were already contemplating goals far greater than mere plunder or trade. They observed the fragmented kingdoms of England. They analyzed their internal rivalries. They recognized their weaknesses, and they reached an increasingly obvious conclusion. If small bands could defeat cities and monasteries, what would happen if thousands of warriors crossed the sea at once? That question was beginning to take shape, and the answer would soon follow. An answer that would arrive in hundreds of ships. An answer that would forever change the history of the British Isles. An answer known to chroniclers as the Great Heathen Army. Over the course of more than 70 years, the Vikings had learned practically everything they needed to know about the British Isles. Each expedition added new information. Each raid revealed weaknesses. Each voyage made their navigators more experienced and their chieftains more ambitious. What began as small-scale raids against isolated monasteries had evolved into a constant campaign of exploration, plunder, and reconnaissance. The Scandinavians were already familiar with the best natural harbors, navigable rivers, wealthiest towns, and, above all, the political rivalries dividing the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. England remained fragmented. Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, and Kent continued to vie with one another. Alliances were formed and broken rapidly. Kings disputed borders, nobles conspired for power, and armies were frequently mobilized to confront fellow Englishmen rather than an enemy from the sea. For the Viking chieftains, this division presented an opportunity. They realized it was unlikely that all the kingdoms would unite in the face of an external threat. While one kingdom struggled to survive, another would often hesitate to help, hoping instead to capitalize on the situation. This lack of unity would prove to be a crucial factor in the success of future invasions. At the same time, profound changes were taking place within Scandinavia itself. The wealth gained from these expeditions empowered certain leaders, enabling them to control larger territories and gather growing numbers of followers. Prestige no longer depended solely on martial valor. It was now also measured by the ability to organize major expeditions, distribute wealth, and secure new opportunities for one's men. Lesser chieftains began swearing allegiance to more influential leaders, forming alliances that gathered hundreds of warriors under a single command. It was a quiet but decisive transformation. For the first time, some leaders possessed the resources to plan military campaigns far larger than any raid undertaken previously. Unlike the early attacks, these new expeditions required months of preparation. Trees were felled to build new ships, blacksmiths worked ceaselessly, producing swords, axes, spears, arrowheads, and iron rivets for the vessels. Women and the elderly prepared provisions capable of withstanding long voyages, such as dried fish, salted meat, butter, cheese, and grains. Every detail required careful planning. Merely crossing the sea was not enough. They needed to remain in foreign territory for extended periods. This meant carrying tools to build camps, repair ships, forge weapons, and ensure supplies for hundreds, perhaps thousands of men. Meanwhile, rumors of a massive mobilization began to circulate among merchants traveling between Scandinavia, Frisia, and the British Isles. Few knew exactly what was happening, yet everyone sensed that something different was in the works. This was not just another summer of raiding. The scale was entirely new. In England, however, hardly anyone grasped the magnitude of the danger. Attacks continued to occur across various regions, yet they were still viewed as local issues. Many rulers believed that reinforcing a few coastal strongholds or increasing the number of soldiers at certain monasteries would suffice. They did not imagine that the next enemy would seek more than just gold. He would come seeking land. He would come to stay. It was against this backdrop that one of the most famous military forces of the Middle Ages emerged, the Great Heathen Army. Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe its arrival as an unprecedented event. Instead of small crews landing for a quick raid, a massive coalition of Scandinavian warriors crossed the North Sea in a carefully organized operation. Although historians still debate the exact number of fighters, there is a consensus that it was the largest Viking force assembled up to that time. It was composed of men from different regions of Scandinavia, Norwegians, Danes, and possibly groups from present-day Sweden. Many chieftains temporarily set aside their rivalries to join the campaign. The objective was too great to ignore. Over the centuries, various sagas have linked this invasion to the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. Figures such as Ivar, known as the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba appear in Norse tradition as key leaders of this campaign. While some of these stories blend real events with legendary elements, it is certain that highly experienced commanders led the invasion, demonstrating strategic capabilities far superior to those of earlier generations of raiders. They did not intend to attack a monastery and return home. They intended to conquer kingdoms. Preparations continued for months. In Scandinavian shipyards, new longships were completed almost daily. Colorful shields were hung along the sides of the vessels. Woolen sails were carefully stitched. Weapons underwent final repairs. In the villages, entire families gathered to bid farewell to those who were leaving. Many would never return. Others would come back laden with riches. Some would find a new home across the sea. When the time for departure finally arrived, hundreds of boats began to slowly leave the fjords and coasts of Denmark. It was an impressive sight. Rows of ships advanced across the waters as their sails caught the cold northern wind. The rowers maintained a steady rhythm. The chieftains watched the horizon in silence. Every man knew he was taking part in something far greater than a mere expedition. On the other side of the North Sea, England went about its daily routine. Peasants worked in the fields. Merchants traveled along dirt roads connecting small towns. Monasteries held masses and copied manuscripts. Very few imagined that the largest Viking force ever assembled was sailing toward them. The first coastal lookouts to spot that immense fleet might have thought their eyes were deceiving them. Never before had so many ships appeared on the horizon at once. News spread rapidly. Messengers rode between strongholds carrying alarming reports. Anglo-Saxon kings began to muster their men. But there was a problem. This time, the enemy was not coming merely to strike and vanish. They had come prepared to fight for months, perhaps even years. The Vikings were no longer just extraordinary navigators and skilled raiders. Now, they were an army. An organized, experienced army determined to redraw the political map of the British Isles. At that moment, the first phase of the Viking Age came to an end. Swift coastal raids gave way to large-scale military campaigns capable of toppling kings, conquering cities, and establishing new domains. The medieval world was about to witness battles that would be remembered for centuries. And among the leaders commanding this new generation of warriors, one name would begin to rise above all others: Ivar the Boneless. His intelligence, strategy, and determination would make him one of the most fascinating and controversial figures in all of Viking history. But that is a story that begins in the next chapter.